Welcome back, folks. Thank you for staying with us. It's about 60 minutes past the hour of 6 a.m. And the Green Paper on internal self-government for Tobago has been completed and has been put out for public comment. The bill entitled Towards Internal Self-Government for Tobago was drafted in consultation with Reginald Dumas and other prominent Tobagonians. We're joined in studio by political scientist Dr. Hamid Ghani and Tobago-born attorneys Chrislyn Moore and Martin George, who have been retained by the government to collate the feedback from the consultation on this matter. Folks, good morning and welcome to Morning Edition.
Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning to you, Hayden, and good morning, Trinidad and Tobago.
Great. Dr. Ghani, let me start with you. What are the fundamental objectives of this Green Paper on internal self-government for Tobago?
Well, the Green Paper is a statement of policy intent. After the public consultations, the white paper would then be the policy position of the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Essentially, what it attempts to do is to amend the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago to limit the powers of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago to make laws for Tobago, so that there shall be a Tobago House of Assembly or a Tobago legislature that will make laws for Tobago that will be styled assembly laws, and that therefore those laws will have effect in Tobago.
Yes.
And then it also attempts to limit the powers of the National Cabinet to formulate and implement policy for all of Trinidad and Tobago, so that the Executive Council of the Tobago House of Assembly will formulate and implement policy in respect of Tobago. Those are the main thrusts of what is happening, so that the issue of collective responsibility of that Executive Council to the Tobago House of Assembly has also been included in it. So essentially it is a fundamental revision to the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago to allow Tobago a greater sense of self-government and final responsibility in respect of its governing its affairs.
Mr. George, when it comes to the scope of these new powers being conferred on the THA, is it that the laws that the THA can now draft can affect all spheres of life in Tobago, or are there specific parameters within which the THA must now act?
Well, there are actually 31 matters which are specifically identified on what is called a Tobago list, and then the 32nd one caters for any other. So in other words, in the course of things, you may develop areas where you realize that there's need for more lawmaking powers, so there is that proviso. But there are 31 specific categories which are set out, which in effect end up giving the Tobago House of Assembly tremendously greater scope and authority than they have at present. And the reason why it's important that we've had the consultations both in Trinidad and Tobago is because it affects not just Tobagonians, but it affects Trinidadians too. Because when you are looking at the extent of the power that is being conferred, it now limits the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago in its lawmaking capacity for Tobago, because you are putting certain matters, 31 matters that are listed here, starting with finance, legal affairs, several areas that are listed. They're all now under the exclusive domain and jurisdiction of the Tobago House of Assembly. So in fact, what has actually come out during our consultations throughout the length and breadth of Trinidad and Tobago is that you have mainly Tobagonians asking and saying, look, are there any limits that are going to be put upon this extensive power? Because when they realize the enormity of the powers that are being conferred on the Tobago House of Assembly by this proposal, they are now asking, well, look, should we look at something like, for instance, a bicameral structure whereby you have the representatives and then you have something akin to like a Senate where there can be some oversight. Some people have also suggested that, look, maybe within a unicameral structure, you have something akin to independent senators or independent bodies coming from civil society, labor, religious organizations, because they see the need for checks and balances. Because while they are desirous of the greater power and autonomy, they want to ensure that it is not an untrammeled, exercise of power or legislative authority.
Yes, and I mean those are some critical issues, and let me just ask Ms. Chrislyn Moore to join this discussion now. When it comes to the, let's say we move forward, we implement this new bill, it becomes law. Is it then that the THA will now have total authority to change these laws as they see fit in the future?
Yes. As Martin mentioned, in the 31 areas over which the Tobago House of Assembly will now have authority, this will be their jurisdiction. This will be the forum on which, or the stage on which they act, and it is quite extensive. Martin mentioned finance and legal, but it extends to state lands, lands and marine parks, museums, public buildings, tourism, culture, community development, cooperatives, agriculture and fisheries. And from our public consultations, we know that the issue surrounding fisheries and fishermen, particularly to Tobagonians in the industry, is extremely critical.
Right.
It extends to food production, forestry, town and country planning, public utilities, roads and bridges, industrial development, the environment, library and social services, quarries, water resources, housing, internal security, and the list goes on. So what it means is that the Tobago House of Assembly does have lawmaking power over these issues. It's quite extensive.
And let me just ask you this. You mentioned, of course, the critical area being finance as part of the 31 matters.
It's first on the list.
Yes, the whole question of taxation.
Yes.
Now, can it be a situation where within Tobago,
yes,
the taxation structure can be set independently by the THA?
Well, interestingly enough, I believe the current THA Act allows for companies who have businesses in Tobago to pay taxes in Tobago. The difficulty, as we've been told in these public consultations, is that ordinarily most of the businesses, or the larger ones at any rate, have branch offices in Tobago. They're headquartered in Trinidad.
Right.
And as a matter of convenience, they pay taxes in Trinidad,
yes,
as opposed to in Tobago, where arguably they ought to be paid.
Yes.
So this is an opportunity to regularize the payment of taxes, perhaps by branch offices. Certainly the THA will have lawmaking power to insist that perhaps the monies be deaggregated, as it will. And this is certainly something we've received arguments about, that monies from branch offices, taxes from branch offices, ought to be reposed in Tobago, whether physically or by some accounting process,
right,
and available for THA to use in the ordinary course of things.
Dr. Ghani, when you look at this particular dispensation, is this akin to a federal structure of governance now? How would you describe the eventual outcome in the final analysis?
Well, the nature of the state under this proposal is not being altered from a unitary state. This perhaps is more akin to the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Parliament or the Northern Ireland Parliament, where you have the Parliament at Westminster in the United Kingdom, but you have Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland having high levels of autonomy within that arrangement.
Right.
A federal structure would require making a state of Trinidad, a state of Tobago, and then having a federal government over that. Of course, in the Commonwealth Caribbean, we have the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis,
that's right,
where there is the federal government in Bastia in St. Kitts, and then there's a Nevis Island administration and a Nevis Island legislature, and it's called a federation. But St. Kitts is not a state. Just Nevis has these powers. St. Kitts is not a state. It's where the federal government resides. So that's a different kind of federation. So we have different models, and in terms of small island states, the St. Kitts Nevis model is perhaps the only one that we have in our region that is called a federation, but doesn't resemble what is a true federation like the United States, whereby St. Kitts would have to be a state with its own island administration,
That's
Nevis
right,
with its own island administration, and then a federal government over all of them. So that this is not a federation. This is a unitary state with a high level of devolution of powers from the center to one of the constituent elements.
Right. Mr. George, when you consider the extent to which these changes may affect how the THA functions, I mean, this is almost as though we are in fact creating these regional areas where we can now have like local government taking on increased powers and responsibilities within a particular jurisdictional area. Is this something that can be modeled for local government reform as well?
The thing is, you see, Tobago has always been different because if you recall, Tobago existed previously as a separate independent entity. And that's the fundamental difference between the Tobago scenario and the rest of the local government bodies, such as the municipal corporations. So the point is, they don't have that history of independent operation. So it's only when Tobago was annexed to Trinidad that you had it becoming the unitary arrangement. So I think Tobagonians, they know their history. They are well aware of the fact that, look, they came from this rich, proud tradition of independence, and that still resonates throughout our discussions with Tobagonians throughout the length and breadth of Trinidad and Tobago, because you have so many hundreds of thousands of Tobagonians living in Trinidad, occupying, positions of power and influence. So that's why we made sure we came down here so that we can give them an opportunity to hear their views also.
Yes.
You also have Trinidadians who are so heavily invested in Tobago, either through businesses, they may have friends, family, persons living across there who they visit on a regular basis. So we have to take this from a national perspective, and we've ensured that we used all the social media. We're on Facebook, we have an email account, we've received submissions by all means electronically, we've been on the television, we've been on the radio, we've tried to cover the entire ambit of the country so that no one can say they did not have an opportunity to make a submission or to be heard or to let their voices be heard. Of course, notwithstanding that, there may still be some persons who, haven't had that chance, and what we'd let them know is that the email address is still available and we can still receive written submissions, because we want to hear from people. Because of the impact and import of these changes,
yes,
we want to give everyone the opportunity to weigh in on it, let your voice be heard. We've had some tremendously exciting sessions. We had some really exciting ones in Roxborough where people went into the discussion of what is a Tobagonian and the definition of a Tobagonian. Then there were issues concerning the definition of what is the exclusive economic zone, what are the territorial waters of Tobago, how do you define Tobago as an island. And I can tell you, the passion and intensity and the depth of submissions and the preparation that people did coming to those sessions, it was remarkable. It was really interesting. We've had persons like Dr. Selwyn Ryan in our audiences. We've had persons from the Express senior reporter Lennox Grant in our audiences. So the level of participation has been extremely high, and the interest and intensity of the debates and discussions, they've really been phenomenal.
Ms. Moore, when it comes to the eventual arrangement that this new piece of legislation will in fact define between Trinidad and Tobago, do you then anticipate that as a result of this, Tobago will have available to it a lot more resources under this particular arrangement?
Well, it will certainly have more legislative power. This bit of legislation really deals with self-determination via the legislative route. Now, of course, if you have access to legislative power, you can so order your affairs to perhaps command more financial power. For example, a simple example would be the ability to collect taxes, the ability to enforce tax codes, the ability to tax in areas you didn't tax before. So immediately you bring more resource earning or resource gathering power to bear. There are, I foresee, a number of ways that this mechanism can be used to monetize the resources. One area of concern that we have gathered quite a lot of interest in is the question of lands in Tobago, and what would be the position, whether via this piece of legislation or perhaps subsidiary legislation, what would be the position of the state of Tobago titles. Now, that is important on a number of fronts. Tobago titles are notoriously bad, and if your title is bad, you have a difficulty as a landowner monetizing the asset. If you have a difficulty monetizing the asset, you also have a difficulty injecting that monetized capital into the economy. So there's a trickle-on effect. So it means that with proper harnessing of the legislative power that the THA is likely to now have, certainly the economic trickle-down effects or the economic knock-on effects are tremendous and unlimited.
So we're looking at a scenario where Tobago may very well have its own economic exclusive zone, Dr. Ghani, and that may have a bearing on when it comes to oil exploration, gas exploration offshore Tobago. It may have a significant bearing on how Tobago taxes those operations.
The Green Paper speaks about 10 miles from the baselines of Tobago, but there has been an argument to us that Tobago doesn't have baselines all around it. And on its southern side, that you don't have baselines, so that there are a number of factors involved. We received some submissions which would suggest a basis for measuring the jurisdictional area of Tobago, because the Green Paper speaks about 10 miles out from the baselines of Tobago. Well, on its northern side, yes, certainly there are measurable baselines, but on its southern side there aren't. So that is an issue we've received submissions on, and obviously it is going to have to be something that the government will have to take into account in preparing a white paper, which will then become official government policy, because right now this is not official government policy. And in that context, the issue of the exclusive economic zone, which is not territorial waters, so that we have the territorial sea. There are three different waters. There's the sort of the one between the shore and the baseline, and then there is the baseline going out 12 miles, which is the territorial water, and then beyond that you have exclusive economic zone.
Yes.
Of course, we are bordered. We have Barbados, we have Grenada, we have Venezuela, we have a number of other territories around us, so that the concept of a 200-mile exclusive economic zone is not an equidistant 200 miles all around.
Of course not.
So that there are a number of international law maritime issues, which I think is a matter that will have to be carefully considered in the way that this is constructed. And we're dealing with the country of Trinidad and Tobago, and then we're dealing with the issue of internal self-government of Tobago inside of the country of Trinidad and Tobago. So there are a number of technical, constitutional, and legal matters involved, and of course the maritime issues arising out of the law of the sea will be another set of issues that would have to be considered. So it is something that does require very careful consideration by the policymakers when they come to make their final decision.
Yes, and I mean, I'm sure it does have some measure of complication, and there has to be, of course, some compromise on the matter. Mr. George, the thing that troubles me, when it comes to things like public utilities, we have entities like WASA, TNTEC, TSTT, and so on. Under this new bill, how will those resources be commandeered from the Tobago side of things? Because, I mean, these are organizations with a central structure.
Right. Yes.
So when it comes to decision making, and it comes to allocation of resources, and of course execution of projects, to what extent will the THA have control or direction within these kinds of organizations?
Okay, well, good question. Now, the thing is, what you have also, you have a concurrent list where there are some areas where it is recognized that there must be cooperation and consensuality between the Tobago legislature and the national parliament. So those matters on the Tobago list, which, and I'll give you some examples, they concern things like ports and airports, which must of necessity concern both islands, right? Your air and sea links. So these are things that are common to both. Things like state enterprises will remain state enterprises, because remember, we are not changing the statehood of Trinidad and Tobago.
That's right.
We would still remain as a unitary state. So therefore, those state enterprises, they will continue to function in the same manner. So there would not be any separation to say, well, there will be a TNTEC Tobago
and a WASA Tobago,
which would be exclusive. No.
And what about the things like the police service, national security, and those matters?
Right. Now, those things will remain the same. However, there is provision for security as one of the internal security as one of the areas where the Tobago legislature can have exclusive control to make laws. So now this would be now akin to the same way how you have like a municipal police force, like for instance how the borough councils would have their borough police.
Right.
So it allows that flexibility to deal with matters of internal security. However, national security remains national security.
So it's quite possible we can have a sort of a Tobago municipality police service?
That's the point. So it gives you the room and flexibility for something of that nature. However, we bear in mind that we are still operating within the context of Trinidad and Tobago as one state. So that's the important point. Now, one of the things that I need to stress for all viewers to understand, throughout our consultations, one of the most important things is that no one at all mooted or touted the idea of secession. Tobagonians do not wish to have secession. In fact, it's only on one occasion that word was mentioned, and it was on a television program in Tobago. The presenter, well, he had very strong views on the idea of secession, but in terms of the public consultations and the views that we heard from the public generally, no one spoke about secession, and it seems very clear to us that Tobagonians are not thinking along the lines of secession. So that's one good thing, because many times when we had the consultations in Trinidad, persons asked about that because Trinidadians want to be assured. They don't want to feel fearful that, look, if they have to go to Tobago, then it's going to be some changed status, know, where you're going to have difficulties getting to Tobago, you're going to be treated as a foreigner or an outsider.
You may have to walk with your passport.
At the end of the day, it's Trinidad and Tobago, So that's one good thing that, I would like to reassure the public about. We did not get that feeling at all. Tobagonians are saying they want greater power, greater autonomy, but within the context of Trinidad and Tobago.
And I mean, I think that's the ultimate goal of this exercise, isn't it? Ms. Moore, when you look at the degree of consultations that have taken place, are you satisfied that you've had a sufficient input, both from Tobagonians and Trinidadians, in the context of how this ought to evolve over time?
Well, certainly we've had tremendous input. I must say the input perhaps, or the level of interest may have been more significant in Tobago, because this is a matter that has been on their domestic agenda for quite some time. Several persons have been actively involved in pursuing this particular process. But certainly we have been witness to some very lively debates, well-researched debates, very articulate debates, and what we've noted are that there are two particular areas of concern, and those areas resonated no matter where the debate was held, no matter where the public consultation was held. One was an issue you touched on earlier, which is the issue of monetizing resources in and around Tobago.
That's right.
And in particular, the resources, the marine resources, fisheries, and the hydrocarbon resources. Those matters were particularly critical, and I must say that Dr. Ghani, Mr. George, and myself at several points in the discourse were placed in the role really of public educators, because these are matters that people need to understand before they can go on to give an informed commentary on these issues as they lay now in the Green Paper.
Yes.
So yes, I would say that with regard to the level of participation and the depth of the debate, one can really not ask for much more.
All right, folks, we're going to take a break now, but when we come back, I'd like us to talk about the next steps and where we go from here in terms of moving this piece of legislation forward. Stay with us. We're going to be right back. Welcome back. It's just about 90 minutes to the hour 7 a.m. And before we continue with Dr. Hamid Ghani, Mr. Martin George, and Ms. Chrislyn Moore, I'd like to remind our tweeps that the question for today is, do you support internal self-government for Tobago? Do you support internal self-government for Tobago? So send us your comments, your questions, and so on. So while we have our guests here, we can at least pose some of your issues to them. Dr. Hamid Ghani, we were about to talk about the next steps in this process. Where do we go from here?
Right. Well, we have a report to write, and we need to submit the report before independence, so that we go into a report stage now, where we will put together a report based on the consultations that we have had, all of the various issues that have been raised at all of the public consultations. We've been keeping a track, copious notes, and on all submissions. We've received various submissions as well, written submissions.
Yes.
So that in a sense, we'll be providing the government with the feedback from the consultations, and then the government will go into its own policy-making mode and make a determination on what the white paper is going to look like. And at that stage, it will become official government policy. And I presume that given the fact that there was a draft bill in the Green Paper, I presume that there will be a draft bill that will be going to the Parliament that will have the modifications that the government wants to make. and that will then be a matter for the government to take forward. Our task will end when we submit the report.
Dr. Ghani, the passing of this legislation, does it require any special majority in Parliament?
Well, the Green Paper speaks to a 2/3 majority in both houses of Parliament.
So therefore this requires the support of the...
It will approximately 28 MPs in the House of Representatives and 21 of the 31 senators.
Right.
So that more or less is the position. The government at the moment is able to command the support of 29 MPs in the House of Representatives. But regardless of size in the House, every government can only count on 15 senators of the 16, because the 16th one is usually the president of the Senate. So that the government will most probably have to look for 6 other senators. So that if it is that there's concurrence between the government and the opposition, then one may presume that the 6 opposition senators may vote with the government to get the 21.
Right.
Or there may be 6 of the 9 independent senators who may vote with the government, or you may have a much wider consensus on the issue. One does not know how that will actually play out in the Parliament at the end,
yes.
but they will need 21 of 31 senators.
So they do need support from the other side, whether it be opposition or whether it be independent.
Independent. There will be the need for support on the other side of the aisle.
Yes.
In the Senate.
Mr. George, when you test the waters with these issues, what's your impression of the reaction of the THA, the incumbent THA, with respect to some of these proposals contained in this bill?
Well, the point is, if you notice the Green Paper, the way it's been structured, it actually traces the history of all the attempts to have this issue of internal self-government in Tobago determined. So they started by looking at the Simangal Commission, and then it traces through all the other previous attempts and the other researches that have been done. So it pays homage and due respect to all the previous attempts, including the documents that have been prepared recently at the behest of the THA. So we have to take an all-inclusive and all-embracing approach to this exercise, because at the end of the day, it's something that you would certainly want the buy-in of as wide a cross-section of the public of Trinidad and Tobago before you come up with your final legislation. And that has been our approach. So that's why we have opened the doors to every possible comment. Whether it's something in favor of the Green Paper, against it, we take all the views, we take all the comments, and all of this will comprise our report. Because at the end of the day, as Hamid indicated, this is your initial document, but the point is, when it reaches the white paper stage, you would then now refine it based upon what you had initially, based upon the feedback and comments, and now you put together something which has the acceptability across the board, because you must have that for it to move forward, so that it doesn't become something that is a contentious and fought over issue, because you want a platform where everyone feels comfortable going forward.
Ms. Moore, let me tell you, and this is exactly what we were talking about. When we talk about internal self-government, let me tell you what one of the tweeps have been saying. No, they don't support, and this is from Ray James, and he says, no, we don't support internal self-government for Tobago. It won't be Trinidad and Tobago. Tobago needs Trinidad. They cannot survive on their own. You see, this is the concept. When you mention the phrase internal self-government, I suppose the average listener, the average viewer, the average citizen of Trinidad and Tobago may sense that this is some measure of secession where Tobago wants to go off on its own. How do we dispel the misconception that this internal self-government is about internal government for Tobago, but it does not in any way weaken the Twin Island Republic of Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, 2 matters. One, the person who commented, their position is that Tobago needs Trinidad.
Yes.
And there is no attempt really, or no attempt at all, to suggest that the islands do not exist in a codependent relationship. The question of secession, or allaying the fears of secession, is really about public education. The bill is not styled or titled an act to ensure the unitary state of Tobago, for example. So even in the naming of the legislation, it is clear that what is intended to be carved out is a separate legal regime, a separate constitutional regime, which gives Tobago some autonomy over its own affairs. So it is a public awareness issue,
yes,
as opposed to an issue of reality over perception. The other thing we've noted is that we have a lot of people who have been postulating comments on an issue that is not necessarily before them. What is before the national public is the question of internal self-government for Tobago.
Yes.
Not the question of secession of Tobago,
yes,
or the independence of Tobago, although these perhaps are legitimate.
Exactly, and from the time people hear internal self-government, to them it means Tobago is going
yes,
off on its own.
But we have not garnered such a wish, we have not garnered such a comment. In fact, persons have stood up in our consultations and